Hello, friends, welcome again. Friends, we all are the students of English literature. While studying this literature, we come across various movements like Classicism and Romanticism, Realism and Surrealism, Feminism and Modernism and Postmodernism, and so on. And if you want to get the real feeling of English literature, if you want to enjoy this study of English literature, you must be well versed with all these different movements which we find in English literature during the different phases in the history of English literature. Friends, in my previous videos, I have discussed classicism, romanticism, feminism, modernism. And today we want to understand realism in English literature. We will discuss what realism is. We will also look at the history of realism, the elements of the literature of realism, and 6 different types of realism as found in English literature. Friends, when we discussed classicism and romanticism, that time I told you that every movement in literature is actually a reaction against some previous movement. Okay, and realism is a movement which was actually a reaction against the exotic and poetic romanticism of the previous period of romantic revival. This realism you find in English literature during the 19th century. Okay? And before this 19th century, if you examine the history of English literature, this period from 1798 to 1830 is the period of neo-romanticism. After this period, that means 1830 onwards, you find a reaction against too much of romanticism which was found in English poetry. And this new movement of realism, it introduced a new manner of writing literature. It gave birth to a new generation of authors whose influence we can see even in today's times. This movement, to be precise, started in the mid 19th century. That means about 1850 onwards, you find the beginning of this realism in English literature, and it continued till the 20th century. If somebody asks you who is the most important author of realism in literature, then you remember this name, friends. Honor de Balzac, who is a French writer, is unanimously considered as the most dominant founders of realism in literature. Balzac is, as I told you, is a French writer who wrote the Human Comedy. The Human Comedy is actually a series of novels and short stories which depict all aspects of French life and French society in its true colors. So Balzac is considered as an important French writer of realism. Right? Now let's begin with the definition of realism. What is realism? If somebody asks you, then you can say that rather than applying filters of fantasy to your fictional world, realism is based on real everyday life. So, we have two terms. One is fantasy and the other one is reality. In literature, we find both fantasy, that means imagination, something which is not real, and reality. Okay? But when the author focuses more on the depiction of realism or the depiction of real life situation, that literature tends to be literature of realism. If the author focuses more on the aspect of fantasy, that means imagination, that literature tends to be romantic literature. Okay? In realism, you will find the characters with genuine jobs and real problems. What are the real problems of a common man? That is the focus of realistic literature. This literature portrays the mundane everyday experiences as they actually happen in our real life. Okay? It depicts the real people, the familiar faces, the familiar places and stories, primarily about the middle and the lower class people. So remember, friends, realism or the literature of realism means it is the literature in which you find the depiction of the real problems of the real people. Okay, and mainly it focuses on the lower class or the middle class or the working class people. Okay, and this type of literature tries to tell a story as truthfully as possible instead of romanticizing the whole situation. Okay, here the author does not at all try to dramatize or romanticize the things. They present it as they are without any exaggeration, without much use of imagination, and that is called the literature of realism. Now, friends, after understanding the definition of realism, let's have a look at how this realism began, or let's have a look at the history of realism in English literature. Okay, this literary realism actually existed, in the times before the 19th century. We say that 19th century is the period of realism, but before that also, if you read the works of Daniel Defoe and Samuel Richardson during the 18th century, okay, there also you find that much of realism is found in their novels. Not only this, if you come to the beginning of the 18th century, you have the two great periodical essays who wrote periodical essays in the Spectator and the Tatler. You remember these names, Joseph Addison and Richard Still. Okay, they also tried to depict, to describe or to present the British society in its purest and the truest form. Okay, so much element of realism is found in the periodical essays of the 18th century and also in the novels of Daniel Defoe and Samuel Richardson during the 18th century. Once realism took a proper shape, George Eliot, an important novelist, published this Middlemarch, a study of provincial life, published in 1871. This is also considered as a very important work of literary realism. Okay, so remember this work. You begin with Joseph Addison and Richard Still in the beginning of the 18th century. During the middle of the 18th century, you have Samuel Richardson, who are also considered as the writers of realistic literature, and in 1871 you please remember George Eliot, Middlemarch, a study of provincial life. This work is also considered as an important literary work of realism. Okay, other writers of the literature of realism are Charles Dickens, George Gissing, Arnold Bennett, and George Moore, and so many others. Okay, they all have voiced the social evils of their society, which may be termed as the works of realism. Right? So, 18th century, you can say this movement was taking a shape. But if you come to the mid 19th century, realism became so much popular among the writers. Now, the question is what are the elements of realistic literature, or what are the important features, characteristics of the literature of realism? Then there are five things you generally find in the literature of realism. Number one, realistic characters and settings are presented. Here, you do not find life presented in the clouds, on the mountains. Okay, real characters and real setting is presented. Detailed description of everyday events. In this literature of realism, the events or the story which is presented is the real story of my life, of your life. Okay, so real life story, real life events are presented in this kind of literature. Not only this, you find real dialects of that particular area. Okay, so the dialects are also real or realistic dialects. Dialects means the language spoken by the characters. That is also real, not too much phraseological. This is the language of the common man, of the working class people, which is presented, which is used in this literature of realism. And as I told you, here the focus is more on the middle class or the working class people. Okay, now if you examine the literature of realism, then you find different kinds or different types of realism. Mainly, there are 6 types of realism in English literature. And what are they? Number 1 is magical realism. You know, the name itself tells us what this magical realism is. Okay, this type of realism, it blurs the line between fantasy and reality. As I told you just now, these are the two terms. Fantasy, that means imagination, fancy, which is not real, and reality. Okay, here in this magical realism, it is very difficult to draw a line between these two terms, fantasy and reality. Magical realism, it portrays the world truthfully, but at the same time it adds some magical elements that are not found in our in real life. Okay, so here you find a mixture of both fantasy and realism, right? If you want one example, then 100 Years of Solitude, this work written by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, published in 1967, is considered as the novel of magical realism. Second type of realism that you find in English literature is social realism. Okay, so here the name itself tells us what this social realism is. Here the focus is more on the society or the social problems. Okay, what social problems a particular society or culture is facing. This is the main focus of such literature of social realism. If you want an example, then Les Miserables, written by Victor Hugo, published in 1862, is a novel of social realism. Okay, it is about class politics. Okay, it is about the social and political problems of the people living in France during the 1800s. Third type of realism that we find is kitchen sink realism. Now, this kind of realism is mainly concerned with the people who go to the pub houses, bars, and all. Okay, this realism focuses on the lives of the young working class British people who spend their free time in drinking in pubs and bars. Okay, so the setting here is mostly restaurants, bars, and kitchens, and that's why this realism is known as kitchen sink realism. The example, Room at the Top, written by John Brain, published in 1957, is a nice example of kitchen sink realistic novel. Okay, another fourth kind of realism is socialist realism. This type of realism was created by Joseph Stalin and adopted by communists, right? Those people who are communists. Socialist realism mainly glorifies the struggle of the working class people. How working class people, they fight against the royal people, the rich people, to get their own rights. Okay, so here the main focus is on communists, right? The main focus is on socially bringing up or say socially showing the development of these lower class people. This work, Cement, written by Fyodor Gladkov, published in 1925, is a socialist realistic novel, right? Fifth type of realism that you find in literature is naturalism. It is an extreme form of realism. Okay, so realism touches the extremes here. This new kind of realism actually came after the influence of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. Okay, naturalism, it is believed, was founded by Emile Zola, who has explored the belief that science can explain all social and environmental phenomena, right? How and why a particular society is poor and why a particular society is rich, why somebody is strong and why somebody is weak. Okay, these questions are answered by science. Okay, so this is what naturalism also believes. Rose for Emily, written by William Faulkner and published in 1930, is a short story about the recluse with a mental illness whose fate is already determined. Okay, this short story, A Rose for Emily, is a nice example of naturalism. And friends, now we come to the discussion of the last type of realism, that is psychological realism. This actually came during the 20th century. This is a type of realism, which is character driven. Here the characters are more important than the story. Okay, and it mainly focuses on what motivates the characters to make certain decisions and why. Okay, psychological realism sometimes uses characters to express commentary on social and political issues. Okay, Crime and Punishment, written by again Fyodor Dostoevsky, published in 1866, is a psychological realist novel. It is a novel in which you find a character who plans to kill a man and takes his money to get out of his poverty. He wants He is a poor man. He plans to kill somebody and to snatch away his money and to be rich. But he feels immense guilt after doing this. So this here in psychological novels and short stories, the focus is more on the psychology of the characters. Okay, so friends, these are the 6 types of realism that we find in English literature. Now, friends, let's wind up this discussion by saying that realism in literature, in English literature, was actually a movement which emerged, as I told you in the beginning, it emerged during the 19th century, and it was a reaction against the previous movement, that was Romanticism. Okay, and realism is a movement of English literature which looks at real life people, real life situation, real life events. Okay, it even explores real dialects of the people. So the language of the people, the common language of the common man, working class people, is found in such works. Okay, it mainly focuses on the depiction of the common man and women, their problems, their conflicts, their hopes, dreams, and ambitions. Okay, so friends, here we come to the end of this discussion. If you have any doubts or questions, do write to me in the comment section of this channel. Friends, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and click on the bell icon so that whenever I upload a new video, you will get the notification soon. Thank you very much.